The photograph landed on the silk tablecloth with the soft thud of a death sentence. It depicted a woman's face, rendered in oils, bathed in a celestial, almost liquid light. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a universe of unspoken sorrow. "There she is," Marcus Blackwood purred, his voice as smooth and treacherous as the aged scotch in his glass. "The girl with the silver lute, lost for 300 years, found." Julian Thorne, the man on the other side of the table, did not reach for the photograph. His own eyes, a flat, metallic gray, remained fixed on Blackwood. Thorne was not a man who had built an empire. He had inherited one, and the weight of that inheritance had pressed all the joy from his features, leaving behind the hard, cynical lines of a man who believed in nothing but price tags. "Found by you, Marcus," Thorne stated, his tone devoid of inflection, "which is precisely the problem." Clara Bishop, standing in the shadows just beyond the intimate circle of light illuminating their private alcove, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She was meant to be invisible, a silent functionary in the opulent theater of the Onyx Room, a restaurant where the cutlery cost more than her monthly rent. Her job was to refill water glasses, to clear plates, to exist as a pair of hands. But tonight, that invisibility was a curse, because the man purring about his discovery was the architect of her family's ruin, and the painting in the photograph was the ghost that haunted her every waking moment. To the patrons of the Onyx Room, Clara was a 22-year-old waitress, weary and efficient, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot. But behind her carefully neutral expression lived the ghost of a girl who had grown up not with dolls, but with brushes and pigments. A girl whose playground was the dusty, turpentine-scented workshop of her father, Daniel Bishop, a man who many in the art world considered the most brilliant restorer of his generation. He didn't just fix paintings, he understood them, communed with them. He taught Clara to see not just the image, but the soul of a piece, the specific craquelure of a 17th century Dutch canvas, the way ultramarine blue made from true lapis lazuli behaves under different light, the subtle inconsistencies in a forger's brushstroke. That life had ended 4 years ago, shattered by Marcus Blackwood. He had been her father's patron, his friend. He had brought the commission of a lifetime, a rumored Vermeer, discovered in a forgotten corner of a French estate. Her father had worked on it for a year, his passion reignited, his genius on full display. He'd pored over historical records, analyzed pigment samples, and authenticated it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Then Blackwood had stolen his research, swapped the masterpiece with a near-perfect forgery, and presented it to the world as his own discovery, discrediting Daniel Bishop as a delusional drunk when he tried to protest. The ensuing legal battle, which Daniel had no hope of winning against Blackwood's army of lawyers, had broken him. A heart attack took him 6 months later, leaving Clara and her mother with a mountain of debt and a legacy of shame. Clara had dropped out of her art history scholarship at Columbia. She sold her father's books, his tools, everything but his memory. She took this job, this penance, to pay for her mother's nursing home, a place that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation. And now across the room, the devil himself was attempting to sell his original sin to a new buyer. "My experts have authenticated it," Blackwood said, gesturing to 2 severe-looking men in Italian suits seated beside him. "The provenance is airtight. The X-rays, the pigment analysis, it's all there." "Your experts work for you," Thorne countered, a flicker of something, not quite boredom, but a deep, unshakable weariness in his eyes. "They see what you pay them to see. I, however, pay them for nothing. Show me something that proves it to me." Clara watched, frozen, as the conversation unspooled. It was a language she understood intimately. They spoke of lead tin yellow, of the specific weave of linen from Delft, of the unique way Vermeer layered his glazes to capture light. Blackwood was slick, reciting facts from her father's stolen notes, presenting them as his own expertise. Clara's hands, holding a silver tray, began to tremble. Every word was a dagger in a wound that had never healed. She could hear her father's voice in her head, explaining the very concepts Blackwood was now butchering. "See, Clara? The forger always betrays himself in the shadows. He paints the shadow as an absence of light. The master paints it as a presence of color. She saw Mr. Henderson, the floor manager, glaring at her from across the dining room, a silent command to get back to work. She forced her feet to move, approaching the table to clear the bread plates. As she reached across, Blackwood glanced up. For a terrifying second, his eyes met hers. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a cold, dismissive smirk. He remembered her, the little girl from the workshop, the daughter of the man he'd destroyed. He saw her now in a servant's uniform, and it clearly amused him. The sight of her powerlessness was a delightful little bonus to his evening. Thorne, meanwhile, was growing impatient. He tapped a long, manicured finger on the table. "Words, Marcus, just words. The painting has a flaw. I can feel it. Everything perfect is flawed. It's the first rule of collecting." "This piece has no flaws," Blackwood insisted, his bonhomie wearing thin. Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned forward, his gray eyes sweeping over Blackwood's two experts, his lawyers, and then, with cruel, deliberate indifference, they landed on Clara. He saw not a person, but a prop, a tool for his own theatrical display of dominance. He raised his voice, a resonant baritone that cut through the restaurant's low hum. "Perhaps my standards are too high for your esteemed colleagues." He gestured vaguely at Clara with his chin. "Let's lower the bar. Let's ask someone with a more grounded perspective." He looked directly at Clara, his gaze a physical weight. "You, waitress." Clara froze, the plate in her hand suddenly feeling as heavy as a gravestone. The entire table turned to stare at her. Mr. Henderson began striding towards them, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What do you think?" Thorne asked, the sneer in his voice a polished weapon. "You've been listening? You must have an opinion." He tapped the photograph of the Vermeer. "Tell you what, find one single, verifiable flaw in this masterpiece, something these experts missed, and I'll pay off your student loans. No, better." A cruel smile touched his lips as he sized up her cheap, worn shoes and starched uniform. "I'll give you $1 million. The offer hung in the air, grotesque and absurd. Blackwood and his men let out sycophantic chuckles. It was a joke, a billionaire's casual cruelty meant to humiliate Blackwood by equating his experts with the lowest status person in the room. He was using her as a punchline. He expected her to blush, stammer, and scurry away in shame. And for a moment she wanted to. The heat of humiliation crept up her neck. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Mr. Henderson was almost upon them. She would be fired, blacklisted. Her mother's care, their very survival, was on the line. But then she looked at the photograph again. She saw the cool light on the woman's cheek, the subtle tension in her hand. She saw her father's ghost, his tired, kind eyes. And she saw the triumphant smirk on Marcus Blackwood's face, the face of a man who had stolen a legacy and was now profiting from the crime. Something inside her, a core of grief and rage that had been dormant for 4 years, finally ignited. He thought she was nothing. They all did. An object, a joke. The world seemed to fall away. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, it all faded into a distant roar. All she could see was the photograph, Blackwood's smug face, and the ghost of her father whispering in her ear. "Look closer, Clara. Always look closer." Blackwood, relishing the moment, decided to twist the knife. "Oh, leave the poor girl alone, Julian. She's the daughter of Daniel Bishop. You remember him, the restorer who went mad? Claimed a forgery was a masterpiece. I suppose a lack of judgment runs in the family." The words were meant to be the final, crushing blow. Instead, they were a release. He had given her an opening. He had invoked her father's name. Clara placed the silver tray on a nearby service stand with a soft, deliberate click. She took a step forward into the light of the alcove. The fear was still there, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. But it was now overshadowed by a chilling, crystalline calm. "Mr. Thorne's offer," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the clarity of a bell in the sudden silence. "Is it genuine?" Thorne's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He leaned back, intrigued by the unexpected turn in his little game. $1 million. wired to an account of your choosing by noon tomorrow. If, and only if, you can prove a flaw. I don't need a wire transfer, Clara said, her eyes locking with his. And I don't need until noon. She looked at Marcus Blackwood, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a tense, wary scowl. May I see the photograph, please? Thorne slid it across the table. Clara picked it up, her fingers surprisingly steady. She didn't look at the face, the part meant to captivate the viewer. She looked at the background, at the shadowed corner of the room where the woman sat. Her eyes scanned the deep, umber darkness behind the subject. Your experts analyze the pigments, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, not looking up. Of course, one of the experts scoffed. Every particle, lead tin yellow ultramarine, bone black, all period perfect. Did you analyze the shadows? Clara pressed. The shadows are just bone black and umber, the man said dismissively. Standard for the period. No, Clara said softly. They aren't. Vermeer didn't paint shadows with black. He built them from color. He knew that darkness wasn't an absence of light, but a different quality of it. His deepest shadows under spectrographic analysis would show traces of ultramarine. He used the most expensive pigment in the world to paint the parts of the room no one was meant to look at. It's what gave his darkness such life, such depth. She paused, tracing a line on the photograph with her fingernail. A forger, even a brilliant one, would see that as an unnecessary expense. He would use the cheaper, more common bone black. It's a perfect chemical match for the period, but it's the wrong artistic signature. It's a shortcut a genius would never take. The alcove was utterly silent. Blackwood's expert was staring at her, his mouth slightly agape. That's a fringe theory, he stammered, a matter of academic debate. It's not a theory to anyone who has actually studied his work, Clara countered, her voice gaining strength. But that's not the real mistake. That's just a symptom of the forger's arrogance. She turned the photograph towards Thorne. Look here. She pointed to the silver lute the woman was holding. A single brilliant pinpoint of light gleamed on its polished surface. The camera obscura effect, Vermeer's signature. Everyone knows Vermeer used a camera obscura to achieve his perfect perspectives and his unique handling of light. The highlight on the lute is a perfect example of that. It's what everyone expects to see. But the forger made a mistake. He's a modern man trying to replicate a 17th century technique. She reached for a heavy silver knife from the table setting. Mr. Henderson, who had been frozen in horror, took a step forward, but Thorne waved him back with a sharp gesture. Clara held the knife up, angling its polished surface. Light doesn't behave this way, she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned everyone, including herself. The highlight on this lute is too perfect. It's a single focused point, but a camera obscura. From that period, with its hand-ground imperfect lens, would produce a slight halation, a subtle blurring or blooming around the brightest points of light. It's called a circle of confusion. Vermeer didn't correct for it. He painted it. It's in every one of his authenticated works. It's his fingerprint. She laid the knife down. This highlight, she said, tapping the photograph, is sharp, focused. It's the kind of highlight produced by a modern camera lens, not a 17th century optical device. The forger was so obsessed with creating the illusion of perfection that he missed the beautiful imperfection that was the master's true signature. She placed the photograph gently back on the table in front of Julian Thorne. The painting is a fraud, she declared, her gaze finally rising to meet Marcus Blackwood's. His face was ashen, his eyes burning with a mixture of disbelief and pure hatred. And it's not the first one you've passed off using my father's stolen research. She turned, not looking at Thorne's stunned face or the shocked expressions of the other men. She didn't wait for a reply. She simply walked away from the table, past the petrified Mr. Henderson, through the hushed dining room where every eye was now on her, and pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic, clattering sanctuary of the kitchen. Her legs felt like water, and her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She had just detonated her life, but for the first time in 4 years, the ghost of her father felt less like a weight and more like a shield. The kitchen was a bedlam of steam and steel, shouts and clanging pots. Clara stumbled towards a stainless steel prep counter, leaning against its cool surface as she gasped for air. Her adrenaline-fueled composure evaporated, leaving her trembling uncontrollably. "Clara, what in God's name did you just do?" It was Leo, another waiter, his young face pale with a mixture of terror and awe. Henderson looked like he was about to have a stroke. "They're going to call the police." "I don't know," she whispered, pressing the heels of her hands to her eyes. The truth was she didn't. A dam of grief and fury had burst, and she had been carried away by the flood. She had just publicly accused one of the city's most powerful men of fraud in front of one of its richest. This wasn't just career suicide. It was complete self-immolation. Back in the alcove, the silence was thick enough to choke on. The two experts were staring at the photograph with new, horrified eyes. Blackwood's lawyers were whispering urgently to him. Julian Thorne hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on the photograph, specifically on the pinpoint of light Clara had identified. He wasn't an art historian, but he was a man who had spent his life surrounded by priceless, genuine objects. He understood the concept of a maker's mark, of an inimitable signature. The girl's logic had been devastatingly simple and utterly convincing. It felt to his cynical mind like truth. Marcus Blackwood, recovering his composure, let out a forced, booming laugh. Preposterous! The ravings of a troubled young woman trying to avenge her disgraced father. It's a sad story, Julian, but it's not evidence. Thorne slowly lifted his gaze from the photograph. His gray eyes were like chips of ice. Is it, Marcus? It sounded a great deal like evidence to me. In fact, it sounded more convincing than anything your two experts have said all evening. He looked at the two men, who flinched under his gaze. Circles of confusion. Is she right? The lead expert cleared his throat, sweating under the collar of his expensive shirt. Theoretically, yes, one would expect some optical aberration, but to spot it from a photograph? So she's right, Thorne cut him off. He turned back to Blackwood, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. You brought me a story. That girl, the waitress, brought me a fact. A verifiable, testable fact. You have wasted my time. The deal is off. Blackwood's face purpled with rage. You're going to take the word of a nobody, a servant, over a lifetime of expertise? Over a signed contract? Your contract contains a clause guaranteeing authenticity, Thorne said coolly. A clause which now appears to be in serious doubt. Get out of my restaurant. It wasn't his restaurant, but in that moment, no one would have dared to correct him. Blackwood stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. He shot a look of pure venom towards the kitchen doors. You'll regret this, Thorne. Both of you, he snarled, before turning on his heel and storming out, his entourage scrambling in his wake. Thorne sat for a long moment in the now quiet alcove. The air crackled with the aftermath of the confrontation. He was a man who distrusted everyone. He believed every person had an angle, a price. He'd initially assumed the girl was a plant, part of an elaborate con. But her performance had been too raw, her knowledge too deep, her hatred for Blackwood too genuine. It wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. He looked up at the terrified manager, Mr. Henderson, who was hovering nearby. The waitress, Thorne commanded. The one who was just here. What's her name? Bishop, sir. Clara Bishop, Henderson stammered. I am so profoundly sorry for her outburst. She is fired, of course. I will have her removed from the premises immediately. Thorne rose from his chair. He was a tall man, and his sudden movement was intimidating. He fixed Henderson with a look of utter contempt. If you fire her, I will buy this restaurant and your contract, and my first act as owner will be to terminate your employment. Am I clear? Henderson's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He just nodded, looking pale. Stay here, Thorne ordered. He then strode towards the kitchen, his movements precise and purposeful. He pushed through the swinging doors himself, ignoring the gasp from the kitchen staff as he entered their domain. The chaotic room fell silent. Cooks froze. Dishwashers stared. Thorne's eyes scanned the room and landed on Clara, who was still leaning against the counter, her back to him. Miss Bishop, he said. The use of her name made her flinch. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide and defiant. She looked so young, so out of place. And yet she had just wielded knowledge like a weapon and brought a titan like Marcus Blackwood to his knees. The paradox was fascinating. "We need to talk," he said, his tone no longer mocking, but intensely serious. Clara lifted her chin. "There's nothing to talk about. I said what I had to say." "You made a rather explosive claim back there," Thorne said, taking a step closer. "You also cost Mr. Blackwood a potential $200 million sale. Men like him don't forget things like that. You just made a very powerful enemy." "He's been my enemy for 4 years," she shot back. "The only thing that changed is that now he knows I'm not afraid of him anymore." A flicker of admiration showed in Thorne's cynical eyes. "And what about my offer? $1 million. Was what you said true? Verifiable?" "You have the photograph," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "You have the resources. Have your own unbiased experts look for circles of confusion on every known Vermeer. Then have them put a spectrometer on the shadows of that painting. You'll have your answer." Thorne studied her for a long, silent moment. His mind was racing. He was a predator in the world of business, and his instincts were screaming at him. There was a story here, a deep one. And at the center of it was this girl, a prodigy hiding in plain sight. This was no longer about a painting. It was about her. "I am a man of my word," he said finally. "My personal banker will contact you tomorrow to arrange the transfer. But I have a feeling this is not just about the money for you." "It was never about the money," she whispered, her gaze distant. "It was about my father." "Daniel Bishop," Thorne said, the name clicking into place. "Blackwood mentioned him." "He destroyed him," Clara said, a raw edge of pain in her voice. "He built his reputation on my father's work and my father's ruin." Thorne nodded slowly. It was all beginning to make sense. This wasn't an academic exercise, it was a vendetta. "Blackwood won't be brought down by a failed sale," he said, thinking aloud. "To ruin a man like that, you need more than a theory about shadows. You need irrefutable proof. You need to gut his credibility so thoroughly that no one will ever trust him again." He looked at her, a new, calculated intensity in his eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by the thrill of the hunt. "The $1 million is yours, Miss Bishop. Consider it a retainer. You and I are going to finish what you started tonight. We are going to expose Marcus Blackwood for the fraud he is, and in doing so, we are going to restore your father's name." He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her something far more valuable: justice, a partnership. For the first time that night, Julian Thorne looked at the waitress and truly saw the person standing before him, and he realized she was the most valuable thing he had encountered in a very long time. The following day did not bring a simple wire transfer. Instead, at 10 in the morning, a discreetly armored sedan parked outside Clara's dilapidated apartment building. A woman in a severe but perfectly tailored gray suit, introducing herself as Ms. Vance, Thorne's chief of staff, met Clara at her door. She wasn't there to hand over a check. She was there to orchestrate a transition. "Mr. Thorne has taken the liberty of arranging a consultation for your mother at the Beaumont Clinic," Ms. Vance said, her tone crisp and efficient. "Their neurological rehabilitation program is the best in the country. A car will be ready for you both in 1 hour." She handed Clara a tablet. "He has also secured a suite for you at the Carlisle. Your current living situation is suboptimal, given the new enemy you've made. Mr. Blackwood is not a man who forgives." Clara was stunned into silence. Thorne wasn't just giving her money. He was deploying his entire infrastructure. He was solving problems she hadn't even had time to consider. The $1 million was a footnote. This was an exercise in absolute power. She thought of her mother wasting away in a state-funded facility, and the decision was made for her. The next 48 hours were a dizzying blur. Her mother was moved to a private suite at the Beaumont that looked more like a luxury hotel room, attended by a team of smiling, attentive doctors who spoke of new therapies and tangible hope. Clara found herself installed in a suite overlooking Central Park, her meager belongings looking pathetic and out of place amidst the antique furniture and silk wallpaper. It was disorienting, a gilded cage she had entered willingly. Thorne himself remained distant. He communicated through Ms. Vance, who provided Clara with a burner phone and a new laptop. Her first assignment arrived via encrypted email. It wasn't a request, it was a test. The email contained high-resolution files of 3 other paintings from Blackwood's private collection, all sold at auction for exorbitant sums over the past few years, all with murky provenances he had somehow managed to solidify. The message was simple: find the flaws. For the first time in 4 years, Clara felt a flicker of the old academic thrill. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a scholar, a detective. She downloaded the files, and the world of the Onyx Room, of exhaustion and petty humiliations, melted away. She worked for 36 hours straight, fueled by room service coffee and a lifetime of suppressed knowledge. She scoured digital archives, cross-referenced auction catalogs, and magnified the paintings pixel by pixel. She found what she was looking for. In a supposed Manet, she identified a trace amount of cadmium yellow, a pigment the artist famously detested and refused to use. In a Degas sculpture, she found that the bronze alloy was inconsistent with the foundry he used during that period. In a cassette, she proved the signature was a forensic impossibility, a perfect imitation of a signature from a letter, not the artist's slightly different canvas signature. Each discovery was a small vindication, a sharpening of the tools her father had given her. She compiled her findings into a detailed, meticulously cited report and sent it back. The reply came not from Ms. Vance, but from Thorne himself. A single line: "My office, 1 hour." Thorne's office was a minimalist expanse of glass and steel on the 80th floor of a skyscraper that bore his family's name. It overlooked the city like a king's balcony. He was standing by the window when she was shown in, not looking at the view, but at a large screen displaying her report. "Impressive," he said, without turning around. "My own teams have been investigating Blackwood for months. They flagged these same pieces as suspicious, but they lack the specific, irrefutable details. You found the kill shots." He turned to face her. The cynical mask was gone. In its place was the focused intensity of a predator who has scented blood. "You've proven your value, Miss Bishop. Now let's talk about the Vermeer." He gestured to a large conference table where a team of 3 people, a stern-looking lawyer, a white-haired academic, and a young, tense tech expert, were waiting. "This is the team. We've had our independent experts confirm your theory about the circles of confusion. They agree it's a powerful indicator, but Blackwood's lawyers will call it circumstantial, academic conjecture. To destroy him, we need the painting itself. We need a physical sample of the pigment from the shadows." The academic, a Dr. Alistair Finch, spoke up. "The painting is currently being held in a private, climate-controlled vault at the Freeport in Geneva while the sale was being finalized. Access is impossible without Blackwood's authorization, which he will now never give," Thorne finished. "He'll bury the painting. In a few years, he'll create a new story, a new set of documents, and sell it to someone less discerning. We have a window of opportunity, and it's closing." Clara looked at the faces around the table. They were talking about logistics, legal hurdles, international law. She was thinking about something else. She was thinking about the mind of the forger. "We don't need to get to the painting," she said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "A forger of this caliber," she continued, thinking aloud. "He's not just an artist. He's a scholar, a historian, a chemist. He's arrogant. He believes he's smarter than the original artist. He doesn't just want to fool the buyer. He wants to fool history itself." She walked towards the screen displaying the image of the girl with the silver lute. "He made one mistake with the highlight, but he won't have made many. Everything else will be perfect. The canvas would have been a genuine, worthless 17th century painting that he scraped down. The stretcher bars would be period correct. The pigments, he would have sourced or created them himself. A man like that doesn't throw his materials away. He keeps them, trophies of his genius." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "You think he still has the materials he used to create the forgery?" "I think he has a workshop," Clara said, a new certainty in her voice. "A secret studio, a place where he becomes the master he so desperately wants to be. The bone black he used for those shadows, a tiny particle of it would be enough. If we can match a sample from his studio to the spectrographic data from the painting, which your team can get from the high-res scans, we can create an unbreakable link between the forger and the forgery. A slow smile spread across Julian Thorne's face. It was a chilling sight. I knew you saw the world differently. We've been focused on the object. You're focused on the man. He turned to his team. Forget Geneva. I want to know everything about Marcus Blackwood's life. Every property he owns, every club he belongs to, every trip he's taken in the past 5 years. Find his sanctuary. The hunt for Blackwood's studio became their obsession. Thorne's team, a private intelligence agency in all but name, dug into every facet of his life. They discovered a remote estate he owned in upstate New York, purchased through a shell corporation, the property records. The night of the incursion was starless and absolute, a slab of obsidian laid over the Hudson Valley. Clara felt the darkness not as an absence of light, but as a presence, a physical weight that pressed in on the armored SUV as it slipped silently through the sleeping country roads. Beside her, Julian Thorne was a study in stillness, his profile etched by the faint, intermittent glow of the dashboard. He had not spoken a word for the last hour, yet the air between them crackled with a shared, high-frequency tension. He was not a man who undertook ventures like this personally, and his presence was a testament to the stakes, a silent acknowledgement that this had transcended business and become something elemental. Clara's own heart was a frantic, caged bird against her ribs. Every rational instinct screamed at the insanity of her situation. She was a scholar, a restorer's daughter, a woman who found solace in the quiet communion with history. Now she was dressed in matte black tactical gear that felt alien against her skin, on her way to commit a felony that could land her in prison for years. Yet beneath the terror, a colder, more resolute current flowed. This was not a choice. It was a consequence, a debt to be paid to the ghost who rode with her, whose whispers had guided her out of the shadows of the Onyx Room and into this moonless night. They stopped a mile from the estate. Two men, introduced only as Stone and Reed, materialized from the darkness. They were specters, their movements economical and soundless. Thorne gave a single, sharp nod. 20 minutes, Miss Bishop. That is the window. Not a second more. If you are not out, they are instructed to leave you. The threat was delivered with the same dispassion as a stock market report, and Clara understood it was not cruelty, but a statement of operational reality. I understand, she said, her voice a dry rasp. The journey through the woods was a sensory deprivation chamber. The men moved with a preternatural awareness, guiding her through the undergrowth with silent hand signals. The forest floor muffled their steps, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a primal smell, a world away from the chemical tang of the city or the perfumed opulence of Thorne's world. Finally, through a break in the trees, she saw it, the guest cottage. It was a simple modern structure of stone and glass, but in the oppressive dark, it seemed to radiate a cold, self-contained energy, a place of secrets. Watching Stone and Reed dismantle the sophisticated security system was like watching surgeons at work, a series of precise, incomprehensible actions with specialized tools, coded signals, bypass circuits, a quiet snip of a wire. The final sterile click of the magnetic lock opening was deafening in the silence. Reed held the door, his eyes sweeping the darkness. Clear. The window is open. Clara stepped across the threshold and the world tilted. The air that hit her was cool, sterile, and yet beneath it, an olfactory ghost rose to meet her. An aroma so deeply embedded in her memory that it buckled her knees. Linseed oil, turpentine, dammer varnish, and the faint, dusty scent of dry pigments. It was the smell of her father's workshop. It was the smell of home. A wave of grief, so powerful and unexpected, threatened to drown her. For a blinding second, she was a little girl again, watching her father's hands, strong, gentle, stained with history, coax life back into a darkened canvas. The sacred creative piece of that space was her entire world. But this place was a profanation, a blasphemous church built to a false god. The interior was not a chaotic artist's loft, but a pristine laboratory. Stainless steel tables gleamed under recessed lighting. Fume hoods hummed softly. On one wall, a vast rack held dozens of aged, stripped canvases, categorized by period and origin. Another held shelves lined with hundreds of glass jars containing powdered pigments, their labels written in a tight, elegant script. It was the arsenal of a master historian, chemist, and artist, all deployed in the service of a single, monumental lie. This was not the lair of a mere criminal, it was the sanctuary of a zealot. "Ma'am?" Stone's voice was a low rumble, pulling her from her trance. "The clock is running." The reminder was a splash of icy water. She moved, her training, her very blood, taking over. Her mind became a cold, analytical engine. She was her father's daughter now, and this was her canvas. She ignored the obvious colors, the brilliant lapis lazuli and vermilion that would have been painstakingly recreated. A forger like this would lavish attention on the showpiece pigments. The true confession, as her father always said, was in the shadows. She went to a steel, fireproof cabinet in the corner. It was locked. Stone was there in an instant, a thin tension wrench and a pick in his hands. The lock gave way with a series of soft clicks that spoke of immense skill. Inside, arranged with scientific precision, were the dark pigments, the umbers, the siennas, the blacks. Each jar was a specific vintage, a recipe reverse-engineered from a known masterpiece. She scanned the labels. Lamp black, C 1650, Rembrandt formula. Ivory black, Velázquez palette. Her eyes hunted, her breath held tight in her chest, and then she saw it. Tucked at the back, a jar slightly larger than the rest. The label was simple, almost dismissive in its confidence. Fumo Ossa, S16, bone black, 17th century. Her heart kicked against her ribs. This was it. The cheap, efficient shortcut a genius would never take, the forgers tell. With hands that trembled only slightly, she opened a sterile evidence kit Thorne's team had provided. Using a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, she extracted a few minuscule granules of the black powder, sealing them in a labeled vial. It was a particle of dust that could topple an empire. As she sealed the bag, her gaze fell upon a heavy, leather-bound book lying on a nearby workbench, held open by a brass weight. It was old, the leather cracked, the pages foxed with age. She knew the binding. She knew the faint, water-stained ring on the cover. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of being caught, seeped into her bones. She walked towards it as if in a dream. It was her father's research journal, the volume that had mysteriously vanished from his studio after his death, the one the estate lawyers could never find. It was his soul on paper, filled with his meticulous handwriting, his elegant chemical equations, his transcendent theories on the spiritual properties of color. Blackwood hadn't just stolen his research, he had stolen his voice, his mind, his very essence. He had hollowed out her father's legacy and wore it like a suit. A rage, pure and white-hot, burned away her fear. This was no longer just about justice. It was about reclamation. She took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather, feeling the ghost of her father's touch. This was the true masterpiece in the room. 5 minutes, Reed whispered from the doorway. Clara turned to go, the journal held against her chest like a shield, but something pulled her gaze to the center of the room. A large easel stood there, draped with a heavy, dust-colored cloth, its shape suggesting a portrait-sized canvas. It was the only object in the pristine studio that seemed casual, a work in progress. It was an anomaly, an inconsistency, and her entire life had taught her to pay attention to inconsistencies. Driven by an impulse she could neither name nor resist, she reached out and pulled the cloth away. The breath left her body in a single silent gasp. The room, the mission, the ticking clock, it all dissolved. It was a Vermeer. Or more accurately, the ghost of a Vermeer being born. The composition was new, yet timeless. A woman sat in a dimly lit room, a beam of northern light falling across her face, her hands holding not a lute or a letter, but a small, leather-bound book. The light was rendered with that signature, liquid quality, the shadows deep and full of color. The technique was breathtaking, a perfect, soulless imitation. But it was the face that shattered her. It was her own. Not a photograph, but a painting, rendered with an obsessive, chilling intimacy. He had worked from the photograph on her old Columbia student ID, the one published online when she had won a scholarship 4 years ago. But he had changed it. He had stripped away the youthful optimism of the original, replacing it with a profound, melancholic stillness. He had painted her eyes with the color of a winter sky, filled with a universe of unspoken sorrow. He had captured her, not as she was, but as the haunted woman she had become. He had painted her as the spiritual successor to the girl with the silver lute. The horror of it was a physical blow. This was not about money. This was not about fame. This was a violation on a level she couldn't comprehend. Blackwood had destroyed her father, stolen his life's work, and now in this secret chamber, he was attempting to colonize her very image, to possess her legacy, to paint her into his tapestry of beautiful, perfect lies. It was the act of a phantom, trying to steal the life from the living. He saw her, he understood her grief, and he was turning it into his next commodity. "Ma'am, we have to go. Now!" Stone's hand was on her arm, firm but not rough. The touch broke the spell. She stumbled back, her eyes still locked on the ghostly portrait. She felt seen, cataloged, and consumed. Tucking her father's journal securely inside her jacket, she turned and fled into the forgiving darkness, leaving the image of herself trapped in that cold, perfect light. Back in the city, in the sterile silence of Thorne's penthouse office, the dawn was breaking over Manhattan, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. The vial of bone black sat on the polished obsidian of his desk like a holy relic. Thorne held her father's journal, turning the pages with a reverence that surprised her. He was not reading the chemical formulas. He was looking at the handwriting, the small, passionate sketches in the margins. "This is the work of a man who loved what he did," Thorne said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual cynical armor. He looked up at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He wasn't just a restorer. He was a believer. In a world full of commodities, he believed in the sublime. He closed the book gently. Blackwood didn't just steal a man's research. He committed a theological crime. Clara said nothing, still reeling from the shock of the portrait. She finally found her voice, the words tasting like ash. "He was painting me." Thorne's jaw tightened. He had listened to her account of the painting without interruption, his expression unreadable. Now a cold, dangerous light entered his eyes. "I understand men like Blackwood," he said, his voice low and serrated. "They are vacuums. They can only acquire. They cannot create. They see beauty, genius, legacy, and their only instinct is to own it, to put it in a box. When he couldn't have your father's living genius, he stole his ghost. And when he saw that same spark in you that night at the restaurant, he decided he needed to own you too, to render you an object, his object." He stood and walked to the vast window overlooking the waking city. "The forensic report on the pigment will be our legal basis. It's irrefutable, but it's not the weapon." He turned back, tapping the journal. "This is the weapon. It proves motive, method, and a pattern of behavior going back years. This will not just expose one forgery, it will invalidate his entire collection, his entire career. It will poison the well of his reputation forever." He paused, his gaze intense. "The police and the courts are blunt instruments. They are for common criminals. Blackwood is not common. His punishment must be tailored. It must be absolute, public." The press conference was staged with the theatrical precision of a royal coronation. It was held in the grand atrium of the Thorne Foundation, a cathedral of white marble and glass. The bait, an announcement of a transformative new acquisition, had drawn every major figure in the art world. Curators, critics, collectors, and journalists filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and avarice. Clara stood in the wings, her heart a slow, heavy drum. She watched Marcus Blackwood arrive. He was luminous, triumphant, basking in the glow of the television lights. He moved through the crowd like a beloved monarch, shaking hands, accepting praise for a career built on the bedrock of another man's soul. He caught sight of Thorne's chief of staff and gave her a conspiratorial wink, utterly oblivious to the guillotine poised above his head. Then Thorne walked onto the stage. The room fell silent. He stood at the podium, a figure of immense understated power. He spoke of beauty, of truth, and of the sacred trust that underpins the world of art. This trust, he said, his voice resonating through the atrium, is fragile, and it has been broken. On the massive screen behind him, the image of the girl with the silver lute materialized, luminous and sorrowful. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Blackwood, in the front row, beamed, assuming this was his moment of glory. A breathtaking work, Thorne continued, his voice taking on an edge of ice. Offered to me by Mr. Marcus Blackwood for $200 million. It is also, from its very conception, a lie. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum. Blackwood's smile froze, then crumbled. Thorne, with the dispassionate cruelty of a vivisectionist, laid out the evidence. The analysis of the shadows, the optical physics of the circle of confusion, the forensic report from a Swiss lab, matching the bone black in the painting to a sample recovered from a private studio. The data scrolled across the screen, a relentless, damning litany. Blackwood was on his feet, his face a mask of purple rage, sputtering denials. But Thorne was not finished. A forger of this skill is a rare talent, but such talent does not spring from a void. It requires a foundation of profound knowledge. Knowledge that was, in fact, stolen. An image of Daniel Bishop appeared on the screen, a warm academic photo from a university brochure. Beside it, pages from his journal, covered in his elegant flowing script, became visible. The genius belonged to Daniel Bishop, Thorne announced, his voice ringing with conviction. A brilliant man destroyed by a false accusation, whose life's work was plundered to build an empire of fraud by the man who called himself his friend. The camera swiveled from Thorne to Blackwood, who looked like a man who had just been shot. He stumbled backward, turning to flee, but the scrum of journalists was already closing in, a feeding frenzy of shouting questions and flashing lights. Thorne let the chaos reign for a moment before raising a hand. A legacy can be stolen, he said, his voice cutting through the din, but it cannot be extinguished. It lives on. He turned his gaze to the wings. It is my honor to introduce the brilliant scholar who uncovered this entire deception, the woman who will be leading the new Daniel Bishop Art Authentication Initiative at this foundation, Miss Clara Bishop. As Clara stepped from the shadows into the blinding light, time seemed to slow. She was no longer a waitress, no longer a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. The light felt like a benediction. She walked to the podium, her steps even and sure. She did not look at the audience. Her eyes were fixed on the writhing, trapped figure of Marcus Blackwood. He looked up, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, their gazes locked. In his eyes, she saw not just hatred, but a flicker of the same obsessive recognition she had seen in her portrait. The look of a man seeing a beautiful object he desperately wanted, and now could never have. She felt the weight of her father's journal in her hands, though it was miles away. She felt the presence of his spirit beside her, not as a burden of grief, but as a quiet, steadying force. She had not just avenged him, she had brought him home. 1 year later, the lab of the Daniel Bishop Initiative was Clara's sanctuary. It was a place of quiet light, of science and history intertwined. The Blackwood scandal had detonated in the art world, leading to a cascade of lawsuits, investigations, and the quiet removal of dozens of paintings from museum walls. Blackwood himself was a pariah, his name a byword for deceit, his beautiful lies dismantled one by one. Clara was bent over a 16th century Italian panel, examining it under infrared reflectography. On the monitor, the ghost of the artist's original drawing, the pentimento, was visible beneath the layers of paint. A hand moved, a gaze shifted. She was tracing the artist's mind, revealing the truth hidden beneath the finished surface. It was her life's work now, finding the ghost in the machine. The door opened and Julian Thorne walked in. He visited occasionally, moving through her lab with a quiet respect he afforded few spaces. He had never touched the $1 million, which now funded her mother's comprehensive care at a clinic where hope was a tangible thing. Her mother had started painting again, small, bright watercolors of the clinic's garden. He stood beside Clara, looking at the spectral image on the screen. Finding the artist's first thoughts, he said. It wasn't a question. It's where their truth lives, she replied, looking up from the eyepiece. A genuine smile touched her lips, an expression of peace he had come to recognize as one of his most valued and unownable acquisitions. Before the patron or the public told them what it should be. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. That night in Blackwood's studio, when I saw the journal and then heard about the painting he made of you, I finally understood. I'd spent my life acquiring objects that were authenticated by their provenance, their history. I saw perfection as a lack of flaws. He turned to her, and the cynical armor in his gray eyes was gone, replaced by a clarity she had never seen before. I was wrong. True authenticity isn't in the perfect surface. It's in the pentimento. It's in the artist's corrections, the evidence of the struggle, the ghost of what was. It's the signature of the soul. He was talking about the painting, but his words encompassed the journal, her father, and her. He was talking about the beautiful, messy, imperfect truths that liars like Blackwood could imitate, but never possess. Clara, a woman the world had seen as broken, had taught the man who bought and sold perfection that the most priceless things are the ones that bear the marks of their own survival. She turned her gaze back to the screen, to the faint, beautiful lines of a truth that had waited centuries to be seen. Outside, the city hummed its endless, ambitious song. But in here, there was only the quiet, steady work of light and the reclamation of all that had been lost.